I am going to invite Matthew up to the podium to start off our conversation with some of his insights about the changing demographics in the Episcopal Church. Matthew.
Thank you very much, Mary Kate. I'm Senior Vice President for Research and Data at the Church Pension Group. We are fortunate to get a large amount of data just given to us. In many ways, it's a kind of a sociologist's dream that, other people have to go out and they have to beg people for the type of data that we get for compensation, for demographics, for employment data. And we just receive that as part of what we do, which is gives us a lot of capacity to come up with insights. We're also elected at each general convention as recorder of ordinations. It was actually a single individual that did it, I think from the formation of the church through until about 1940-something when that person retired, I think finally. And they then decided to hand it over to the pension fund. So we receive all the ordinations, receptions, canonical transfers, any sort of movement within the church, which is reported to us by the diocese. Some data we don't get. People think we have data on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. That's data that we don't get, but it's certainly something that is of interest to the church and has come up in a number of debates. So we're going to talk about 5 major trends that we have noticed in the church. The first one is not unfamiliar to anybody in this room. Resource constraints. The church as a whole, as we know, has fewer members in each congregation. So if you look at the underlying statistics of the parochial report, over the last 10 years, there's been a roughly 20% drop in membership in ASA, but there's only been a 10% drop in the number of parishes. Now, you don't really need a statistical background to know that that means that you've got fewer people per congregation. Congregations also tend to be aging. We have probably, I think, maybe us and the Presbyterians have the highest proportion of any denomination of people over age 65. And we have a static pledge and plate income. Now, actually, static is a remarkable achievement. Because if you think that we actually have a declining number of members, the fact that the income stream is stay constant means that those that are remaining are actually increasing their commitment and pledge, which is actually something that's fairly impressive. And, costs don't go down. There are the buildings that we have, not so much in this part of the world, but certainly where we are from on the East Coast. I mean, I know that the parish that I'm from had the most elaborate slate roof possible with lovely floral patterns in it and the little flowers. The slate came from one slate mine somewhere in Maine. When it was damaged, church insurance did replace from that. I know this because they had to go back to the slate mine and wherever it was to get the rose-colored slates. But these things are not cheap. There is a rising level of cost in terms of buildings, in terms of programs. So this has led, in many ways, to new ways of doing ministry. We see more people who are part-time. We see more people who are working at multiple employers. That could be that they're at multiple parishes. It could also mean that they work at the diocese, part-time basis, and also at a parish, or at a school and at a parish. People working inside and outside tech. So in a lot of dioceses, there's actually now a policy in which if somebody is going to get ordained, they make it clear to them that they should maintain their existing career. We went to Albany, where they have a very definite program on that, and we met a set of clergy. We met somebody who was a floor and carpet salesman, somebody who was a contractor, somebody who ran a hearing aid business, and someone else who was a prison guard, which is great training for, you almost don't need to go to seminary at that point. You know it all. It certainly make your congregants a little bit nervous in terms of playing up. So we're also seeing more people with interrupted service. So this is people who just, in a sense, life occurs. We, in a series of focus groups that we did, met people, for example, and it's not, from this area, you could imagine this. This is somebody who was a priest in El Camino Real, and spouse worked in the tech industry. Company transferred that spouse from one tech area down here to the Research Triangle. The person gets there, of course, the priest has to leave the place, decided to leave the place they're at, and then has to sort of start over again. And so starting over meant actually sort of some interims to get going. But all of these involve kind of gaps, or people who take time off to look after children or maybe aging family members. And so life in general is not necessarily always a smooth line. There are bumps in the road, and so we do see that. Related to that is what I would call non-linear compensation patterns. So the classic income path that people see, which really is existing less and less in every profession, is this notion that you come in after you've been to graduate school and you start at a certain level and your income rises nicely, and then it sort of peaks in your 50s and plateaus. And to some degree, you did see that somewhat in the church under what we would call the old model. Wasn't really a model, it was more just like a little bit of a moment in time through the 50s and 60s. But that's in some ways, yes, for a while, clergy careers did conform to that. But what we see much more is that people's compensation goes in up and down over their careers and is, in a sense, not moving in that straight line. And then finally, what we see is a blurred line between active and retired. I was actually just talking with Paula today about her parish, Mary the Virgin, where in fact there is a cleric there who is in his 80s and is a retiree, but still working. And so what we once had in the pension fund was we had a full retirement age 50 years ago. At the 50th anniversary, the full retirement age was 68. Life expectancy was only into the mid-70s at that point. So, and people were ordained in their late 20s. So people were working for 40 years, and the pension fund literature actually early on talked about, the pension deservedly for clergy who were worn out after all of the, after that 40, and who wouldn't be after that 40 years. And so now, though, we see clergy maybe retiring early, certainly not waiting until 68, but then continuing to serve. So we see this blurred line between active and retired. Now, if we look, not every single one of those trends, but the first 5, the people who are in those groups, we find part-time, multiple employers, working inside and outside tech, interrupted service, are predominantly female, and also tend to be later at age ordination. So we actually see 2 trends that are in many ways sort of overlapping each other. What we see, looking back to, if we take as our starting point, sort of 1967, 50th anniversary of the pension fund, we see 2 big demographic changes in the clergy. We see female clergy, and we see people ordained at older ages. And those new demographic groups also are disproportionately represented in these new ways, these new patterns of ministry. We also have the growing presence of deacons. We did have a pattern in which, for a while, we have to sort of go back historically. There was underreporting of deacons 50 years ago, but we still know that there were not a large number of deacons. So it then went over the 1,000 mark about 25 years ago. Now we have over 3,000 deacons in the church, which is a big number. If we're talking about sort of 6,000 active priests, and about 6,000 plus retirees, then 3,000 deacons is a lot of people. They work mostly on a voluntary basis, so they're on the whole unpaid by tech, and most of them have an employment or retirement income from somewhere else. But they do a lot in the church, an awful lot of service, pastoral work, and work in our service organizations. Again, older average age of ordination of even priests. Now, the average age of priests is now down to about 44, 45. But for deacons, ordination is still into the 50s, and the average age of a deacon is over 60. So, lay employees. One of the things in 2009 that occurred was that General Convention passed some mandates for pensions to be provided to lay employees and also for health benefits. Now, there are remaining differences still between clergy and lay benefits. Back in 2009, I was part of that effort to pass that legislation. We did a big survey and found that only about under 70% of lay employees working over 20 hours had pensions. The church had actually already mandated through a resolution that lay people should have pensions. Some dioceses, California notable amongst them, actually did carry that out, but many did not. And so we went back to General Convention and said, we need to give lay people the protection of a canon, because that's what clergy have. And we debated a long time about whether or not the existing mandated level of 9% should be changed. But we decided that we probably couldn't get both done. And so a decision was made that to give people something. We read these heartbreaking stories of teachers who had worked for 25, 30 years in Episcopal preschools, or administrators who'd worked for all of that time who had nothing at the end of that period. So that was our first priority, was just to make sure that everybody was covered. But, obviously there's a difference between when you pay in 9% versus 18%. Now let's look at compensation. It's interesting, two graphs, lay and clergy. Patterns are important. Overall numbers can be misleading. So if we look at the difference between male and female employees, lay employees, it's 14%, which is actually the same as it is for clergy. But if you see what happens with the clergy, male clergy, which is the line in blue, they actually have that sort of, what I was talking about earlier, which is that income arc, the one that sort of rises up and sort of really peaks at the end. And that obviously, in terms of not the pattern that we have now in the pension fund, but the pattern that we inherited from the 1960s, was one that really rewarded those last years. So male clergy are tending to get that final last job. They start off roughly the same. With lay employees, the difference really is constant throughout. If anything, it sort of shrinks to nothing at the end, in the opposite of the clergy pattern. So that's my section. All right, thank you. Come on up.